Hello friends, and welcome back to the Mothership. Today we're doing another episode of our Cook It Like a Brisket series. And this time around we are doing the chuck roast. And this is also known as the poor man's brisket. Sound good? Let's get started. This is a chuck roast. It's about 3.5 pounds, pretty standard size for what I find around here. Let's get her out of the cryovac and see what we are working with. Now sometimes you get chuck roasts that don't have these big pockets of fat. Those are probably ideal, but this is what I had. What I'm going to do is take off any of these big hard fats, especially on the edge. Yeah, that's not going to render. It's not going to do you any good, so you may as well just pull it right off. Now pockets like this on the side, you could try and dig it out. Honestly, you're not going to really get to it, which is kind of annoying, but it is what it is. You could cut into it like so. That works. But you're going to reach a point where you can't go any further. Kind of like that. Now usually I wouldn't even do this, but for the sake of the video, I may as well show you can get into it. But the problem is, when you do that, you start to separate. We really don't want this to really come apart. So I'm just going to leave this like that and just kind of forget that I did that. Because usually that would not be something I would do. You can see it's starting to pull apart here. But around the sides, take off anything a little funky. You know the drill, guys. And if there was any silver skin on here, obviously take that off as well, which there is not, which is nice. All right. Now that looks pretty good to me. Again, wouldn't have taken that out, but it is what it is. So, now, if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I like to salt my meat before I put anything else on there. I like to get the salt on, I like to let it absorb, because your bark is really created from your pepper, creating that different surface, and your garlic if you're using that as well. The salt is going to get absorbed, so any spot where you had salt on there, it's going to get absorbed, and that's not a spot where you're going to develop, you know, your bark, or you're going to develop anything. It's just going to be bare meat. So, we are going to start with salt. Now, like I said, this is about 3.5 pounds. My usual is about 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt, 2 pounds of meat. You can go a little bit further than that. I wouldn't go more than 1 teaspoon per pound of meat because that'll be very salty. Somewhere in the middle probably is all right. But you just want to get it all salted down, particularly focusing on the meat side. Now when you're salting, you really don't actually even have to do the sides because it will get absorbed. So really just focus on the flat side of the meat where all the surface area is. Good. Flip her over. Perfect. Now I'm going to get onto a wire rack and throw this whole thing into the fridge. I'm going to let it rest until all that salt is absorbed. It could take anywhere from, you know, an hour to 2 hours, or even less, but probably about 2 hours. That's enough time for everything to get absorbed. Then we'll go ahead with putting on the rest of our rub. And we're back. All the salt, as you can see, has been absorbed, so it's time to get the rest of our rub on. I'm going to go with some coarse black pepper, and then some garlic powder. Make sure we get both sides. And then, of course, we got to get the sides themselves. And that looks pretty good to me. Now it's time to get my Weber kettle set for smoking. Okay, now everything's set up. I want to get the internal temperature to about 250 before I put the meat on. Alright, we're up to temp, so let's toss this on. Just like with my briskets, I'm planning on cooking this, kind of just ignoring it until we get to the stall. And that's when I usually wrap it. I only spritz if we get to a point where it starts to dry out, but I usually just let it do its thing until about 165 degrees. I'm going to just work on getting some smoke on there by tossing on, you know, some chunks of wood one time. So we'll come back when it's time to either do some spritzing or to wrap it. We are about 4.5 hours in. We're definitely, honestly, we might be pushed through the stall. We're at 180 degrees. I usually would have wrapped by now, but my bark really hasn't set right. That's probably because of the way this cut is. It's pooling a lot of moisture. So I'm hesitant to wrap it because I really don't want to lose whatever bark I can agree on this. So I think what I'm going to do is actually just try and push it all the way to the end till it probes tender rather than wrap it. And then I'll wrap it at that point and, you know, put it in a cooler and let it rest. But yeah, a lot of pooling, which is a problem. I'm trying to, you know, keep moving it around. Honestly, if I could have, I probably would have put something underneath it so I could have made it angle more. I could probably put this piece of wood there, that might work. But yeah, the pooling is a problem. It's pulling off a lot of that bark. You can see it's coming right off on there. It's very soft. But I'm going to keep running this all the way to the end, I guess at this point. We are, like I said, about 4.5 hours in and an internal of about 180. I'm looking for that probe tender, which is probably somewhere around 195 to 201. About 5.5 hours in, and I think this is done, guys. It's probing nice and tender. It's never going to probe as tender as a beautiful USDA prime brisket, but it's pretty close. It's definitely tender. I think this is time to come off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it up. Maybe put a little bit of tallow on there, but I don't think it's necessary. There's a lot of rendered fat here. But wrap it up, put it into a cooler, and let it rest like I would just any brisket. And we'll come back when it's time to slice it open and see how it looks. Now this has had a nice rest. Let's pull her out. And let's cut her open. Honestly, there is really not a straight set of grains here, so cutting it open is going to just be one of those things where we're just gonna slice it and see what we can get. Now none of that looks bad. There's a smoke ring on there. Oof. It's a lot like a brisket. Look at that. Once it kind of fall apart. Looks really good to me. There's definitely these big pockets of fat in between there. And that was kind of just the problem with doing this chuck roast is you're going to have those big kind of weird intramuscular pockets of fat. And they're hard to fight around, honestly. But, I mean, it looks pretty good to me. I'd eat that. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, chuck roast is not high on my list for things I want to cook like a brisket. But you know what? I've seen the poor man's brisket being brought up many, many times, being as a good alternative to doing just a full brisket. And I get it. Honestly, briskets can get super expensive, especially up here in the Northeast, whereas a chuck roast is actually pretty affordable. I have done Triscuits, I've done picanha, I've done a bunch of different cuts of beef. I would say the Triscuit is probably where I'd lean to if I want to do a smaller cut of beef versus a full brisket, but the chuck roast is definitely something I wanted to try. Now this chuck roast was like 3.5 pounds, and we have a nice smoke ring on here. I mean, what's not to love about that? Everything looks fantastic. We cooked it for, honestly, only about 5.5 hours. I cook this the same way that I do my brisket, which is put salt on first, let it absorb into the meat. Then I covered it with a rub of just straight coarse black pepper and garlic powder. Then I cooked it on my Weber kettle at 250 to about 275 the entire way. A couple points heading almost at 300 and a couple points down at 225, but the majority was in that 250 to 275 range. Now this cut of meat was a little different than most briskets I've done because there was a lot of pooling on there, so I actually let it run the entire way. I didn't wrap this one at all. I wrapped it at the very end once I pulled it off in some tallow and put it into my toaster oven just to let it sit there and let all the juices kind of recombine. But I didn't get that point where I could wrap it for the stall and take it all the way to the end. But since this was such a quick cook, I didn't need to do that. Now, as far as our smoke ring, it's kind of small compared to what I usually get. Not entirely sure what that's all about, but you know what? It looks pretty good. It's got some decent rendered fat in there. Looks yummy. I mean, this pull apart, look at that. It's like the accordion style there. It looks great to me. But I think the real proof is going to be in the pudding. Let's give it the old-fashioned chomp. So here's what we're going to eat. Looks pretty good to me. Honestly, it's a lot like a flat, guys. It is definitely not like a point. It's not super fatty, but it's pretty similar to a brisket flat. I'm actually kind of surprised. I was expecting it to not be anywhere near as good. But, you know, taking this to that 195 to 200 degree range where everything probes tender, it really does taste like a brisket flat. Now, I would say the propensity for this to dry out is pretty high. Honestly, some of these pieces look a little bit further along that cooked range that I would want for an actual brisket. I want mine to be much more juicy, but some of these look a little bit more drier. And I'm probably going to use those to chop up and make a sandwich. But in general, it is surprisingly like a brisket. And it's honestly not that bad. For a poor man's brisket, I think the name actually fits. It is definitely the poor man's brisket. It's not as flavorful or as fatty or juicy as a brisket, but it definitely tastes pretty similar. Honestly, if you're new to the smoking game or you're just cooking for a small amount of people and you don't want leftovers, which is crazy because who doesn't want brisket leftovers? But if you are, honestly, rather than spending 70 bucks on a prime brisket, you could buy a nice chuck roast and give it a try. You can use it on a new smoker to kind of figure out those temperature swings. You can use it to get different flavors, doing different types of rubs. Honestly, for the price for a chuck roast versus a full brisket, it's actually a great way to just kind of test out different stuff. But since this is not the first thing I've cooked like a brisket, other than a brisket, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts down below. What is your favorite type of meat or different cut of beef to do like a brisket, other than just a good old-fashioned full packer? So let me know that down below, guys. But most importantly, as always, cook something fantastic, and I will see you on the next UFO barbecue, and I'm going to eat this delicious piece. Bye-bye.